The snow had begun falling before dusk, slow and steady like time refusing to pass. By nightfall, the town was blanketed in white silence. Most houses glowed with soft yellow lights, the hum of carols leaking through cracked windows, fires crackling behind stone hearths. But not Caleb's house. His cabin sat on the edge of the old timber road, wrapped in stillness. No lights, no music. Just the ticking of a wall clock and the soft hiss of wind sneaking through poorly sealed windows. Caleb sat in his old armchair, staring at the fireplace that hadn't held a flame in weeks. The woodpile beside it was untouched. He hadn't bothered. Not this year. A tin cup of lukewarm coffee rested in his hand, untouched since dusk. The pill bottle sat beside it on the table, open but not yet poured. He'd stared at it for hours, like a man waiting for permission. This was the third Christmas, without Marin, the third since the fire, and tonight he felt the cold not just in his bones but in the hollow space where her laugh used to live. He leaned forward, rubbing his scarred knuckles together. The burns had faded to pale pink patches, but he still remembered the heat. The scream. The seconds too late. Outside, the storm began to thicken, snow falling heavier now, driven sideways by wind, the kind of night no one should be out in. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. Caleb didn't move. He told himself it was the wind. A branch. His mind. But then it came again. Louder. 3 steady raps. He stood slowly. His body had learned to distrust urgency, especially when it came at night. He opened the front door a few inches, just enough to let the cold punch through. They stood there, 4 figures, shivering under a threadbare quilt. A woman, no more than 30, holding a girl on her hip. 2 boys flanked her, their faces red from wind, their jackets far too thin for a night like this. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, breath puffing in white clouds. "We didn't mean to. We just need somewhere to get warm. Just for tonight. We'll leave first thing, please." Caleb's jaw tensed. He didn't answer. His eyes scanned the children. One boy clutched a stuffed rabbit, the other had blood on his knuckles. The little girl was crying soundlessly, face buried in her mother's collar. "Please," the woman whispered again. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Caleb didn't believe in signs, not since the day everything went to ash, but something in the woman's voice, maybe the way it cracked on the word else, broke something frozen in him. He stepped back, wordless, and held the door open. She hesitated only a moment before guiding the children inside. The boys didn't look at him. The girl hiccuped. The woman nodded, grateful but tense. "I'm Eve," she said softly. "These are my kids, Micah, Jonah, and Lila." Caleb said nothing, just shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The cabin smelled of dust and disuse. He reached for the matches, struck one, and lit the oil lamp on the shelf. A warm glow pushed back the gray. "Sit," he said gruffly, motioning toward the couch. "I'll get the fire going." They moved as one, huddled, silent. Caleb knelt by the hearth, stacking logs like ritual. Flint sparked, flame caught. Within minutes, the room began to shift. Shadows danced. Warmth crept into the silence, and the children's shivers slowed. He turned to see Lila curled into her mother's lap, eyes heavy with sleep. Jonah stared into the fire like it held answers. Micah, the eldest, watched Caleb with the quiet alertness of a boy forced to grow up too fast. "You hungry?" Caleb asked. Eve nodded. "They haven't eaten since noon." He heated a can of soup on the stove, ladled it into chipped mugs. No one complained. The kids devoured it like it was a feast. Caleb didn't eat, he just watched. And listened. "Your place is warm," Eve murmured. "It wasn't," he said. "Not until you knocked." She looked at him then, really looked, and something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the first shape of something not quite, fear. That night, Caleb gave them the loft upstairs. Old quilts, thick socks, a hot kettle left steaming on the table. He returned to his chair, the fire now crackling steady, shadows dancing across wood walls like memories refusing to settle. He didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Then, the creak of floorboards. A blanket shifted. A child's cough, and then, quiet. Caleb sat in the glow of the fire, scarred hands folded together, staring into the flame. He had been so sure this night would end him. But then came a knock, and behind it, not ghosts, not sorrow, not the past, but breath, and warmth, and the weight of 3 small children pressing snow into his floorboards. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Maren, what do I do now?" But the fire offered no answer. Only heat. Only light. Only the sound of a house beginning finally to warm. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through clouds and frost-dusted windows. The world outside Caleb's cabin had turned to glass. Tree limbs sagged under the weight of snow, and every surface shimmered with ice. The kind of cold that cracked wood and silenced even the birds. Caleb stood at the stove, the smell of weak coffee rising like memory. He hadn't changed clothes, hadn't shaved. The fire still burned low in the hearth, casting a golden arc across the wooden floor. Upstairs, soft rustling told him they were awake. He had planned for silence today. A last day. The kind of day no one else would remember. But he would feel it go out like a match in the wind. But the knock had changed everything. Or at least postponed it. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Footsteps creaked overhead. A child's laugh, quick, accidental, then hushed by a mother's whisper. A minute later, Eve appeared on the stairs, one hand trailing the rail, the other steadying Lila on her hip. Her eyes met Caleb's, unsure. I hope it's all right," she said softly. "We didn't want to wake you." "I was up," Caleb muttered, setting down a mug. "You all warm enough?" "Yes," Eve nodded. "Thank you." Again. The 2 boys followed, barefoot and blinking like they'd wandered into someone else's dream. Jonah clutched the stuffed rabbit from last night. Micah looked around, taking everything in, the tools above the mantel, the fire, the man beside the stove who still hadn't smiled. "There's coffee," Caleb offered. "Foods, well, it's oatmeal. You'll need to add sugar." Eve accepted the mug with both hands, fingers red from the cold. "This is more than we hoped for." Caleb said nothing. He watched them eat. Jonah kicked his heels softly against the chair legs. Lila spilled a spoonful and looked around guiltily. Micah never took his eyes off Caleb. "You said just one night," Eve said after a while, her voice low. "I did." She nodded, and silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had edges softened by the scrape of spoons, the scent of wood smoke, the sound of Jonah humming to his rabbit. Caleb found himself studying her. She looked tired, but not broken. Her features were delicate, but her spine straight. She wasn't the kind of woman who begged easily. He respected that, even if it made him uneasy. "Where were you headed?" he asked. Eve hesitated. "North. I have a cousin in Montpellier, but I don't know if the address is still good." She moved a lot. "Why not stay closer?" "I couldn't." Her answer was firm, final. She didn't owe him more than that. Caleb nodded. He understood the need to put distance between yourself and something that once held your name. He looked at the children. Again. Lila was now curled on the floor near the hearth, eyes fluttering. Jonah had found a pencil and was drawing on the back of a receipt. Micah sat still, wary. "You protect them," Caleb said quietly. "They're my whole life," Eve replied. He remembered saying the same thing once, not long before the fire took Maren. His wife had been a gentle soul but fierce when it came to love. She would have taken one look at this family and said, "Let them stay." But Caleb wasn't Maren. "I meant what I said," he muttered. "I'm not good with people. This place, it's not set up for company." Eve looked up. I didn't expect kindness, just shelter. One night was already more than we deserved. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being seen as kind. I don't have much, he added. We don't need much, she said, not with pity, but quiet truth. That silence again. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window, watching flakes drift past like ash. The road outside was still buried. Even if he wanted them gone, they'd never make it out before dark. One night. That was the rule. That had to be the rule. But he looked over his shoulder at Lila, her tiny body curled beside the fire, thumb half in her mouth, hair sticking up, like baby duck fluff, and something cracked deep inside his chest. It was the same way wood gives into flame, not quickly, but once it starts, it never stops. Caleb sighed. The storm's not letting up, he said gruffly. You should stay. One more night. Eve looked up, startled. Are you sure? No, he muttered, but the fire's still going. For a moment her eyes shimmered like the snow outside. She said nothing, just nodded once as if afraid to breathe too deeply and shatter the moment. Later that day, Caleb chopped more wood, his shoulder aching from an old injury. Micah followed, him outside, wordless, small boots crunching behind him. He didn't ask questions, just stood nearby, holding logs as they fell. When Caleb finally spoke, it wasn't to test the boy. It was to tell the truth. You don't have to be brave, all the time. Micah looked up, quiet as wind. Then he said, I'm not. Only when Mom's watching. That night the wind howled around the cabin, but the fire held. Lila slept under Eve's arm. Jonah murmured in dreams. Micah finally drifted off beside the couch. Caleb sat in his chair again, but this time he didn't feel like a man waiting to disappear. He still didn't know what he was doing. But for now, the fire was warm. The children were safe. And for the second night in a row, he let the door stay closed against the snow. The cold didn't lift by morning, but the house had changed. It wasn't just the temperature, though the fire, now fed and flickering steady, had chased the worst of the chill into the corners. It was something quieter, subtler, a stillness no longer marked by absence, but by presence. There were sounds now, soft footsteps overhead, muffled laughter from the boys trying not to wake their sister. The creak of floorboards that hadn't spoken in months. The distant hum of a kettle someone else had put on. Caleb sat at the table, one hand around a chipped mug, watching a line of frost creep along the edge of the window pane. He used to hate that sound, water turning solid, time slowing down. But now, it felt almost honest. Morning, Eve said quietly as she stepped into the kitchen. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she wore the same sweater as the night before, sleeves pushed up just enough to show a fading bruise along her wrist. He noticed, but said nothing. Caleb wasn't a man who pried. If something needed to be said, he figured it would come. Until then, he focused on the fire, the woodpile, the next cup of coffee. But still, he noticed. Boys are trying to build a fort in the back room, she said, half apologetic. As long as they don't use my good tools. She offered the hint of a smile. They don't know which ones are good. Caleb let out a soft grunt, the closest he came to a laugh. He pushed a plate of toast across the table. Not much, but it's hot. More than enough. They ate in silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence shared by people who'd run out of fear and were learning how to breathe again. Lila stumbled in not long after, her curls wild, dragging a blanket behind her like a cape. She clambered into Eve's lap and stared at Caleb with sleepy suspicion. You the fireman? She mumbled. He raised an eyebrow. I suppose I am. She blinked slowly. I like fire. It's warm. Caleb's chest tightened. There had been a time when he loved fire too, when it meant life, not loss. He didn't answer, just reached for another log and placed it gently on the hearth. Can we hang our stockings? Jonah asked. appearing suddenly with a tangled mess of red yarn and a sock with someone else's name stitched across the side. Eve looked startled. "I didn't pack those." Jonah held it up like treasure. "Found them in Mom's bag. They're wrinkly." Micah was behind him, clutching a bundle of cloth. "Mine still smells like cinnamon." Caleb stood. He didn't know what to say, but he went to the small coat closet by the front door, rummaged through a drawer, and came out with 6 old nails and a rusty hammer. "Fireplace is still strong," he said, walking over to the mantel. "She can hold a few more memories." One by one, the kids handed him their stockings. Lila's had a glitter glue L that was half peeled. Micah's was missing a toe. Jonah's had bells that jingled faintly with each movement. Caleb hammered, slowly, deliberately, as if each thud could knock a little grief loose from the walls. When they were done, the kids stood back and stared at the mantel like it was magic. "I didn't think we'd have Christmas this year," Micah murmured. "You still might," Caleb said before he could stop himself. Eve looked at him then, not with hope but with something heavier, something like gratitude laced with guilt. She pulled Lila close and whispered, "Say thank you." The little girl looked up at Caleb. "Thank you, fireman." He nodded once and turned away before his face could betray him. That afternoon, while the children played in the back room, now a battlefield of blankets and couch cushions, Caleb found himself staring at the old workbench by the window. It had been covered in dust for over a year. Tools rusted in their drawers. Wood planks leaned like forgotten stories. He hadn't built anything since Marin died. He didn't plan to start now. But somehow his hands moved on their own. He cleared the surface, wiped down the clamps, ran his fingers along a piece of pine until the shape of it returned to him. He didn't know what he was making, only that he needed to. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, but inside, the cabin hummed. The kettle whistled. Someone laughed. Eve stepped into the doorway as the sun dipped behind the hills. She was holding a small paper star, cut imperfectly, the kind only a child could love. They wanted to hang this above the fireplace. Caleb nodded. She hesitated. This was supposed to be just one night. He didn't look up. Still could be. She walked closer. "But it's not, is it?" "No," he said. "Not anymore." She stared at the fire for a long time. Then, placed the star gently above the mantel. It tilted to the side as if leaning in. That night, Caleb sat in his chair, sore from sanding, his palms covered in sawdust. The fire burned bright. The stockings shifted gently in the heat. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. The house was still old, the pain still there, but it was warmer now. And somewhere upstairs, a little girl had just called him the fireman again, right before falling asleep. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving the world glazed and silent, like the earth had been sealed beneath glass. Sunlight filtered through the frost-crusted windows, casting soft gold across the cabin floor. It made the place look gentler than it was. Caleb stood at the sink, rinsing out the same tin mug he'd used for 3 days straight. The water, still, cold despite the fire, stung his knuckles, skin worn from too much chopping, too many years of living like a man unfinished. Behind him, Eve sat at the table, Lila asleep across her lap. The boys were outside with sticks, pretending to be warriors, or wolves, whatever small boys become when the world finally gives them space to breathe. Caleb didn't interrupt the quiet. He had grown used to the hush of this house, but now the silence felt shared. He turned, drying his hands with an old cloth. "You sleep at all?" "A little," Eve said, her voice frayed around the edges. "It's easier here." Caleb raised a brow. "I didn't mean..." She hesitated. "Just when the fire's going and the kids aren't scared, I forget what I'm carrying." He nodded slowly, returning to his seat across from her. She looked different in the light, less guarded, but still held together like something mended and not yet tested. "I know what that's like," he said. Eve looked at him for a long moment. "Do you?" He didn't answer. He just reached for the fire poker and nudged a log into place. "Micah told me you used to be a firefighter," she said softly. Caleb's hands stilled. "Yeah," he said after a beat. "I was." She waited, but he didn't offer more, so she filled the silence instead. "My husband was too," she said. "Volunteer. Back home in West Virginia. Small town. One engine, hand-me-down gear, no ladder truck." Caleb looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time that morning. His name was Jason. He wasn't trained, not really, but he had a good heart, always wanted to help. He knew what was coming. He saw it in the way her eyes drifted toward the fire, as if she could still see it burning. There was a house, 2 kids trapped upstairs. He got the first one out. Ran back in for the second. Roof collapsed before he made it out. Caleb exhaled through his nose. Not from surprise, but recognition. "He didn't die right away," Eve whispered. "I held his hand in the hospital. For hours. He never spoke again. Just squeezed once, then let go." Caleb didn't speak. Couldn't. His mind had gone somewhere else. Back to the call he'd answered just outside Brattleboro. The old barn lit like a bonfire, the scream in, the smoke. The moment he'd reached the front door, just one breath too late. Marin's breath. He hadn't told anyone. Not since the funeral. Not since he buried her with half his own soul. "I'm sorry," he said. And it wasn't just words. It was marrow deep. "I used to think it was my fault," Eve said, stroking Lila's hair absent-mindedly. "I asked him to go back in. The mom was screaming, and I panicked. I begged him." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He would have gone anyway." She blinked at him. "You don't know that." "I do." His voice was low, firm. "Because I did the same damn thing. No one asked me. I just thought I could beat the fire." Eve stared at him, eyes wide. Caleb looked down at his palms, scarred and pale, a permanent reminder of everything he hadn't saved. "I got out," he said, "but I didn't get her out." He didn't say Marin's name. He didn't have to. Eve leaned back in her chair, the two of them now adrift in the same quiet sea. Lila stirred, let out a tiny whimper. Eve rocked her gently, whispering something, soft into her hair. When she looked back at Caleb, her face had changed. "You live with it?" she asked. "Every day." "Does it get lighter?" He looked at the fire. Not lighter, just quieter. Outside, the boys were laughing, chasing one another with snowballs. One of them shouted, "Avalanche!" and dove behind a drift. The sound echoed into the trees and vanished. Eve smiled faintly. "They don't remember him the way I do. I envy that sometimes." "You shouldn't." "Why not?" "Because one day they'll ask what kind of man he was, and you'll be the only one who can tell them." Eve looked down. "And what about you?" "What about me? If someone asked, 'What kind of man are you now?'" Caleb didn't answer right away. He sat back in his chair and looked around the room. At the worn floorboards, the fire, the stockings still hanging, crooked and hopeful. At Eve, holding a child not born of him, yet somehow seated like she belonged. "I don't know," he said at last. "But I'm trying." And for the first time in years, that answer didn't feel like failure. It felt like the beginning of something he hadn't dared name. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the house had gone still, Caleb passed the workbench again. The piece of pine he'd picked out was still there, smooth now, its shape beginning to emerge. He hadn't told anyone yet, not even Eve, but he was carving something. A cradle. He didn't know why, only that it felt like faith. The morning came, with pale light and the soft hush of snowfall, gentler now, like the storm had exhaled and left behind only its breath. Outside, the world looked softer than it had any right to, like a postcard left in the mailbox of a man who had stopped checking years ago. Caleb stirred the oatmeal on the stove with one hand, the other resting on the edge of the counter for balance. His shoulder ached from splitting wood, and the skin on his fingers cracked from the cold. But for once he didn't mind. The ache meant something had been done. Something small, maybe, but real. From the back room came the thump of small feet, first one pair, then two more. The boys, already half-dressed, already warring with snow pants and jackets and cardboard swords. Eve followed a few moments later, bleary-eyed and wrapped in a shawl. She gave him a soft morning, then set to pouring tea and coaxing Lila out of her blanket cocoon on the couch. "Sleep okay?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the bubbling pot. "Better," she said, her voice still morning rough. "Micah didn't have any dreams last night. First time in weeks." Caleb nodded. He didn't say he'd sat up by the fire most of the night, listening to the creaks in the floor, checking the stove, watching the moon rise silver through the window. He didn't say that since they arrived, he hadn't taken a single pill from the bottle on the shelf. He didn't need to. Jonah came bounding into the room wearing a scarf tied like a cape, holding a spoon in one hand and a wooden spatula in the other. "I'm Sir Jonah the Brave!" he shouted. "Not with that spoon," Micah called from behind him. "That's for oatmeal. You can't use a spatula as a sword," Caleb muttered without looking. "I can if it's enchanted," Jonah said seriously. Caleb glanced at him. "And what's it enchanted with? Maple syrup?" Jonah grinned, proud. "Exactly." Caleb shook his head and turned back to the pot, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth before he could stop it. That's when it happened. From the couch, curled in Eve's lap and still wrapped in her blanket, Lila let out a sound, a tiny giggle. Just one, but it rang through the cabin like a bell. Eve looked down, startled. "Did you just laugh?" Lila's eyes were bright, cheeks rosy from sleep. "Fireman's funny," she whispered. Jonah puffed up. "I made her laugh." "Nope," Lila said with the authority of a 4-year-old. "He did." She pointed a tiny finger at Caleb. The room froze for half a second. Then Caleb, who had not been called funny in over a decade, who had forgotten what it was to make someone small and hurt laugh, turned away too quickly. "Breakfast's ready," he mumbled, but his ears were red, and something warm bloomed beneath his ribs. They ate together, the 6 of them squeezed around the table that was never built for this many elbows or this much noise. Micah corrected Jonah's spelling on a crumpled note. Eve helped Lila with her spoon. Caleb poured a second round of coffee, then a third. Afterward, while the kids bundled up for a snowball war in the yard, Eve lingered behind, her hand resting on the edge of the table. She hasn't laughed since. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Caleb nodded once. "She trusts you," Eve said quietly. "She trusts the fire," he replied. "Maybe," she said, "but the fire doesn't make oatmeal, or fix their socks, or put up with sword fights before breakfast." He didn't know what to say to that. So he didn't. Outside, the children's laughter pierced the air, clear, honest, wild. Caleb moved to the window and watched them. Jonah was rolling Lila into a snowball fortress while Micah stood guard, scanning the trees like a sentinel. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes bright. And for the first time in so long, it didn't feel like they were just surviving. They were playing. He found himself reaching for his coat. "You going out there?" Eve asked, surprised. "Someone's gotta teach them how to build a proper fort," he said, already lacing his boots. 10 minutes later, he was crouched beside Micah, showing him how to pack snow so it wouldn't collapse under pressure. The boy listened closely, nodding, mimicking his movements. "You ever build one before?" Caleb asked. Micah shrugged. "Jason, my dad, he tried, but the snow back home was never this good." "Dry powder," Caleb said. "Never sticks, right?" Micah looked up. "You know snow?" "I know a few things." Micah was quiet for a beat, then asked, "Do you miss her?" Caleb stilled. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "Every day," he said. Micah nodded. "Me too." That afternoon, while the children napped and Eve stitched a hole in Jonah's sock by the fire, Caleb returned to his workbench. The cradle had taken shape now, its frame curved and sanded, each corner smoothed like the edge of a memory. He didn't know if it was for Lila or for something deeper, but his hands moved with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Later, Eve stood in the doorway watching. "You're making something," she said. "Looks that way." "For us?" He hesitated, then said, "For whoever needs it." She didn't press. She just stepped beside him, ran her fingers along the smooth edge of the wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's unfinished." "So are we," she said, then smiled. That night, as the fire burned low and the last of the snow melted from the kids' mittens by the door, Caleb sat in his chair, watching the stockings sway gently in the heat. Lila had laughed. Micah had talked. Jonah had called him Sir Caleb the Grumpy and lived to tell the tale. And for a man who had once planned to vanish in the dark, that felt like a miracle. A small one, but real. It began with tire tracks, faint but wrong. Caleb spotted them the moment he stepped out to fetch firewood. Parallel lines carved into the snow, too deep and too wide to be from his own truck, and too recent to be from anyone in town. He followed them with his eyes until they disappeared into the bend of the trees, just far enough to be out of sight from the cabin, just close enough to raise the hair at the back of his neck. He stood there a long time, the wind brushing cold against his face, his hands resting on the woodpile, but no longer moving. The kind of stillness that comes when a man knows something isn't right, even if he can't name it yet. Back inside, the fire was crackling, the smell of cinnamon drifting from the stove. Jonah was humming to himself, drawing on a paper bag, with a marker that had long since dried out. Lila slept with her head on Eve's lap, her breath slow and even. Eve. Caleb's eyes moved to her. She was bent forward slightly, brushing Lila's hair with her fingers. Peaceful, relaxed. He didn't want to take that from her, but something in him tightened, and he knew he'd have to ask. "Did anyone know you were coming here?" he said. Quietly, Eve looked up, startled. "No, why?" "There's a fresh set of tire tracks by the road." She went pale. "Big truck," he added. "Wider than mine." Someone turned around, but they got close. She stood, gently shifting Lila to the couch, her voice suddenly low and sharp. "Was it black, F-150, back wheel squeaks?" Caleb narrowed his eyes. "You recognize that description fast." She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly smaller. "It's him." "Who?" "My ex." Caleb didn't speak, but his entire body stilled. "His name's Randall. He's not the kid's father, not really. Jason was their dad, but Randall..." She swallowed. "I married him after. I was grieving. Lonely. It was a mistake. I thought he'd protect us. What did he do?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Everything." Caleb stepped closer. "Did he hurt them?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. He always knew better than to touch them. But me? Yes. Sometimes in ways I didn't even have bruises for." Caleb's fists clenched, the old burn scars on his knuckles pulling tight. "I left 6 weeks ago. Took the kids in the middle of the night. I thought I was careful. I didn't think he'd find us here." "You didn't. Tell me." "I didn't want to lose your kindness," she said, looking at the floor. "I was afraid you'd send us away." He exhaled sharply. "You think I'd do that?" "I don't know what people do anymore," she said. "I stopped expecting help a long time ago." Caleb turned to the window. The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting the snow in a golden haze. The tire tracks would be gone by morning, but the threat wouldn't. He ran a hand down his face and spoke, rough and quiet. "I'll make sure he doesn't come near you, or the kids." Eve shook her head. "You don't know him. He's vindictive. He files reports, pretends to be calm. He'll lie to the sheriff, make it look like I'm the one who ran. Then I guess it's a good thing Sheriff Halverson owes me about 3 favors." Eve looked up, startled. Caleb shrugged. "Used to pull his son out of trees back when I was still running into fires." Her shoulders sagged in relief, but it didn't last. That night the wind rose again. The cabin groaned against it, the old timbers creaking. Caleb stayed awake, sitting by the fire, the rifle he hadn't used in years now cleaned and propped near the door. Eve slept with Lila tucked against her chest in the loft. Micah and Jonah lay on the floor below, curled under quilts in innocence. They didn't know. Caleb wasn't sure if that was a kindness or a mistake. Around midnight, headlights flashed through the trees, just once, then vanished. He stepped onto the porch in his boots and coat, watching the bend in the road like a man watching the edge of a battlefield. Nothing moved, only wind and falling snow. But he knew. Randall had found them, and Randall was waiting. The next morning, Eve found him at the kitchen table, maps spread in front of him, coffee gone cold. "You were up all night," she said. "Didn't want to. Miss anything?" Her hands trembled as she poured a fresh cup. "He's going to try something." Caleb didn't argue. He looked at her then, really looked, and he saw it. The strength it had taken her to run, the weight she still carried in her bones. "You're not alone," he said simply. A long pause, then she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe you." That afternoon, while the kids built snowmen and hung new paper stars in the windows, Caleb went to town. He spoke with Sheriff Halverson, explained the situation, gave him Eve's name, and the truck's description. Halverson looked at him like he already knew. "I'll keep an eye out," the sheriff said. "You keep them safe." Caleb nodded. When he returned home, Eve was sitting at the fire, Lila curled in her lap, Micah reading aloud from a book he could barely pronounce. Jonah was asleep on the rug, marker still in hand. Caleb stood there a long moment before stepping in. No one asked what he'd done that day. No one needed to. But that night, he placed a chair by the front door and sat there, waiting, because he knew what it meant to lose the people you loved once, and he would not let it happen again. The storm came back 2 nights later, hard and fast like a fist through glass. It rolled, in with a sky the color of wet slate, the wind cutting like a saw, snow driving sideways against the cabin windows. By nightfall, visibility was down to feet. The kind of weather that made you stay inside, stoke the fire and wait. But Caleb didn't feel safe. Not because of the wind, not because of the snow, because Randall was still out there, somewhere. Micah felt it too. He was quieter that night, hovering near the hearth with Jonah, his eyes flicking toward the front door more than once. Even Lila, normally full of sleepy mischief, clung to Eve's side like a second shadow. Caleb double-checked the lock, pulled the rifle from its hiding spot behind the coat rack, loaded it. He didn't like the feel of it in his hands. He never had. But tonight wasn't about comfort. It was about protection. He caught Eve watching him from across the room. Her mouth was a firm line, her hands wrapped tight around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. Her eyes met his, said everything they didn't. "We know, we wait." The knock came just before midnight. 3 hard raps, not cautious, not polite. Caleb stood slowly. Eve moved the children behind the couch, wordless, practiced. He stepped to the door. "Who is it?" The wind howled. Then a voice muffled by the storm but sharp enough to cut. "You know who it is, sweetheart." Caleb felt Eve go still behind him. "I'm not here to fight," the voice said. "I just want to talk. Let's be reasonable." Caleb's voice was cold. "You're not welcome here." A pause. Then, "This isn't your family, man. You don't get to make that call." Caleb unlocked the door, opened it halfway. Snow blew in like smoke. Randall stood just outside the light. Big man, hood pulled back, face red with cold, eyes too calm. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I just want what's mine." "They're not yours." "She is," he snapped, jerking his chin toward Eve. "She's still my wife. Legally separated." "She's filed," Caleb said evenly. Randall smirked. "So you're her lawyer now?" "No. I'm the man standing between You and the kids. That was when Randall's eyes changed, just a flicker, but Caleb had seen it before. Firefighters learn to read a room seconds before it goes to hell. He slammed the door shut just as Randall lunged. The impact hit like a battering ram. Glass cracked. The frame shook. Back, Caleb shouted. Eve grabbed the kids, dragged them, toward the kitchen. The second hit came louder. Then wood splintered. The door burst open. Randall stumbled in, half covered in snow, fists up. You want this to be messy? He growled. Fine. Caleb raised the rifle, but didn't fire. I don't want to hurt you, he said. You think I care what you want? They circled each other, the fire casting tall shadows on the walls. Eve was in the far corner, blocking the kids with her body. Randall moved first. A lunge, a shoulder. Caleb sidestepped, slammed the butt of the rifle into Randall's ribs. The man roared, swung wildly. Fist caught Caleb's jaw, sent him staggering. He tasted blood. His leg buckled. The old injury screamed, but he didn't fall. He turned, tackled Randall into the side table, both of them crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and breath and rage. Get out! Eve screamed. Randall snarled, elbowed Caleb in the side, scrambled toward the fireplace poker. Caleb reached first, grabbed it, raised it, stopped. I will not be the monster, he said, then swung, low, sharp, to the side, knocked Randall's legs from under him. The man hit the floor with a crash that echoed. You're done, Caleb said, panting. You so much as breathe near them again, I won't stop next time. Sirens wailed in the distance, closer than they should have been. Eve had called earlier, he realized. Sheriff Halverson must have been waiting nearby, snow chains and all. Red and blue lights spilled across the walls. Randall cursed, struggling to rise. But Caleb stood over him now, poker still in hand, blood running down his chin, fire burning, behind him. You picked the wrong night, he said. The door opened wide. 2 deputies rushed in. They cuffed Randall, hauled him out. And just like that, the storm broke. Only this time it was quiet. After the deputies left and the door was boarded up with Caleb's old lumber scraps, Eve sat on the floor, arms wrapped, around all 3 kids holding them like they might vanish. Caleb stood there bruised, bloodied, and still. He didn't go to her. Not yet. He didn't want to crowd the moment. But then she looked up at him, her eyes full of something that wasn't fear anymore. She stood slowly, walked across the room and wrapped her arms around him, tight, desperate. Caleb froze, then slowly laid his hand on her back. She trembled against his chest. A soft sob, a breath. I thought I forgot how to feel safe, she whispered. Caleb shut his eyes. I thought I forgot how to love. They stood like that for a long time, fire crackling behind them, snow softening outside. He'd risked everything, and in doing so, found something worth the burn. Caleb had seen fire before, too much of it. But he'd never heard it the way he did now. It was the sound that woke him, not the roar, but the pop, sharp, dry, unnatural, followed by the crack of timber. The groan of something giving way. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, shirt half-buttoned, sockless on cold wood. Smoke. He smelled it before he saw it. Then Eve's scream cut through the dark. Caleb! He burst through the loft door. The old wood stove pipe had split, and a section of the back wall near the pantry was glowing orange. Flames danced up the frame like fingers clawing for breath. Sparks burst into the beams above. The fire was moving fast. Out! Caleb barked. Get the kids out now! Micah grabbed Jonah by the arm. Eve swept Lila up, still wrapped in blankets. They ran, barefoot into snow, past the porch, out into the yard, lit by the horror glow of the burning house. Caleb hesitated. Just a second, then turned and ran back inside. The cradle. He snatched it from the workbench, wrapped it in an old tarp, and hauled it outside. Behind him, heat surged. Smoke filled the stairwell. He stumbled out, coughing hard, eyes watering. The roof hissed once, then gave way. The flames reached the rafters and climbed like they'd always lived there. Eve was kneeling in the snow, holding Lila close. The boys stood behind her, stunned into silence, eyes wide and glassy. Caleb dropped the cradle beside them and fell to his knees. No one spoke. They just watched the fire consume everything. Everything they'd just begun to call theirs. The sirens came late. Snow had slowed the plows. By the time the engine arrived, it was over. The cabin stood like a charred skeleton, glowing with ruin. Caleb watched it from the tailgate of a paramedic's truck, a wool blanket around his shoulders. He could feel the singe on his arms, a scrape along his cheek, but none of it hurt as much as the hollow in his chest. Sheriff Halverson approached, breath fogging the air. "We think it was the stovepipe. Too old. Dry air didn't help." Caleb nodded dully. "You could have died going back in," the sheriff added. Caleb looked at the cradle, soot-blackened tarp still wrapped around its base. "Some things you don't leave behind." Halverson nodded slowly, then looked at Eve and the kids huddled by the fire truck. "You want me to find a shelter?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "No." "You sure?" He stood. His legs were shaky. His voice wasn't. "They're not going anywhere." That morning, as the sun climbed behind the broken trees, the family, yes, family, he called them that now, stood by what was left. Lila buried her face in Eve's shoulder. Micah traced a finger in the snow where the front steps had been. Jonah sat in silence beside Caleb, watching the smoke rise. "I made a snow angel over there," Jonah said softly, pointing to the ruined patch of ground near the pine. Caleb didn't answer. His throat was thick. Eve touched his arm. "We'll start again." "Where?" he rasped. She looked at the ashes, then at him. "Right here." It didn't make sense. The roof was gone. The walls were black. Every piece of furniture, every page, every stocking, reduced to heat and memory. But Eve wasn't wrong. Because when the town woke and heard the news, they came. All of them. The baker's wife arrived first with muffins wrapped in towels. Then the sheriff, hammer and nails in hand. Then Mr. Holcomb from the hardware store, his arms full of lumber. Even the pastor, who Caleb hadn't spoken to since Marin's funeral, showed up with thermoses of coffee and a shovel over his shoulder. No one asked permission. They just showed up. By afternoon, the fire was out, the smoke had thinned, and a circle of neighbors stood around the blackened house like a vigil. Quiet, respectful, but not mournful. Hopeful. Halverson cleared his throat. "We've got a few old trailers on the edge of the lot behind the church. One's got heat, running water." Caleb opened his mouth to decline. Eve touched his hand. He looked at her, then nodded. "We'll take it." The kids moved in that evening, the trailer cold and creaky but dry. Caleb fixed the heater. Eve cleaned the counters. Micah found a spot for the cradle near the back window. It wasn't home, but it was enough. For now. Later, as night settled and the kids finally drifted into restless sleep, Caleb stepped outside. The stars were out, clear and sharp. Eve followed, a minute later, blanket over her shoulders. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They stood side by side in the dark. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." He turned to her, startled. For what? For the fire. For what it took. He shook his head. "You didn't cause this." She blinked. "I just keep wondering if I'm bad luck. If wherever I go, things fall apart." Caleb exhaled slowly, the cold turning it to steam. "It wasn't bad luck that brought you here." She looked up. "It was timing," he said. "And timing saved my life." She swallowed hard, eyes wet. "We lost the house," he said. "But we didn't lose this." She reached for his hand, held it tight. And in the stillness that followed, the old ashes settled. And something new, quiet, tentative, but alive, took root. Spring came slow to Vermont that year. It didn't announce itself with color or warmth, but with small mercies. A drip from the eaves, the crunch of thawed ground under boots, the way wind lost its teeth for just an afternoon. At the edge of town, behind the church lot, the trailer still sat. The screen door still creaked. The floors still groaned when too many feet ran across them at once. But inside, something had shifted. Lila had begun humming again. Jonah taped drawings of imagined castles to the window. Micah, quiet as ever, had taken to measuring things with a bent. Ruler for the new house, he said, and Eve had started to unpack in ways that weren't just physical. Caleb watched it all like a man afraid to breathe too hard and wake from a dream. The lot where the cabin had stood was still blackened, still raw. But the ground had softened. The snow was gone. And the town kept showing up. One nail, one board, one act of neighborly stubbornness at a time. They didn't ask questions. They just kept coming. Your back porch will be better than the first, the baker's husband said, laying out new planks. Got insulation this time, muttered the hardware clerk, as if that justified the miracle they were quietly pulling off. And Caleb, unused to hands that gave without price, didn't say much. He just worked, harder than he had in years. Every evening he came home with his hands scraped, clothes dusted with sawdust, and shoulders aching with something that wasn't quite pain. Eve always had tea waiting, sometimes soup, always light. 1. Afternoon, Micah pulled him aside. The boy held a paper, crumpled and soft from being carried too long. What's this? Micah didn't answer, just opened it, a sketch. Wobbly, careful, a tree, roots tangled, branches high, beneath it, the promise tree. Caleb stared at it. Micah looked up. Can we plant one? Caleb cleared his throat. Yeah, I think we can. They planted it 2 days later, just beyond the edge of the build site, where the new house's front window would one day look out. It was a small sapling, bare branches, root ball wrapped in burlap. The kind of tree that didn't ask for attention, just patience. Jonah wanted to name it. Lila wanted to give it a scarf. Eve brought out 3 old teacups and filled them with water from the trailer sink. They stood in a circle around the little hole they dug, muddy and uneven, hands dirty, knees wet. Caleb lowered the tree in, straightened it, packed the earth himself. Then Micah reached forward, quiet, reverent, and pressed the paper drawing into a small wooden box, buried it beside the roots. For later, he said. Eve's voice trembled. For who? Micah looked at Caleb. For us. That night, Caleb lay awake in the small bed near the back of the trailer. The window above him showed a slice of sky, just wide enough for stars. He listened to the children breathing, to Eve's slow footsteps as she checked the lock, to the silence that no longer frightened him. His mind wandered to the tree. How something so small could one day outlive them all. The next morning he found Jonah sitting on the step sketching again. A lopsided house, chimney smoking, a swing on the porch. Caleb smiled. You dreaming up the rest of it? Jonah nodded. It's gonna have stairs, and a room just for puzzles, and maybe a big table for everyone. Caleb crouched down beside him, knees cracking. That sounds good. Jonah looked up. Will it be ours forever? The question hit deeper than he expected. He didn't answer right away. Just stared out at the empty lot, the framed skeleton of what was rising there. The tree bare and shivering in the wind. Then he said softly, Forever's a long time. Jonah's shoulders dropped. But, Caleb added, we can choose, each day, to stay, to build, to belong. Jonah thought about that. Like the tree? Caleb smiled. Exactly like the tree. Later that week the walls went up, a roof followed. The floor of the new living room was made of old wood Caleb had salvaged from the cabin ruins, cleaned, sanded, given new purpose. I want them to remember, he told Eve. She just nodded, eyes glassy. You think this is really happening? she whispered one night as they stood beneath the porch frame, the breeze tugging at her hair. Caleb looked around, at the nails in his palms, the sawdust in his cuffs, the stars. Yeah, he said. I think it is. She stepped closer, her voice barely a breath. I used to pray for a home. He turned to her, something soft in his chest he hadn't named in years. You built one, he said. From pieces, from ashes. Her hand found his. I didn't do it alone. Caleb squeezed her fingers, held them like roots. They stood there until the wind quieted, until the hammering stopped, until the sky turned the color of thaw, and the tree they planted, small and still, stood watch like a promise no longer whispered, but lived. The new house wasn't perfect. The floors creaked. One window stuck in the frame. The front porch railing had a slight lean to it no matter how many times Caleb leveled it. But it stood, solid, warm, and full of breath. The firewood was stacked high again. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and clean laundry. The dining table, hand-built by Caleb with knots and flaws left visible on purpose, sat under the front window where the morning light came in. And in the corner, just beside the new hearth, stood the cradle, finished, sanded, painted soft white. Empty, now but ready. Because home, Caleb had come to understand, wasn't just about walls or roofs. It was about having room for what might come next. He stirred the fire with one hand and settled into his chair with the other. The wood popped gently, a quiet rhythm he'd once feared and now trusted like a heartbeat. Behind him, the kids were at the table. Jonah was reading aloud from a picture book, skipping every third word. Lila was coloring with 2 crayons at once, narrating each stroke with serious conviction. Micah was drawing blueprints again, already adding a second story to the sketch of the house they hadn't yet finished moving into. And Eve was by the window, arms folded, watching the wind stir the branches of the promise tree. She turned toward him, caught his eye, smiled. He smiled back. A year ago, he wouldn't have believed this was possible, that someone would fill the house with light again, that children's laughter would echo down the hall, that a woman who had lost as much as he had would reach for his hand without fear. But here they were. Here he was. I found the ornament box, Eve said, lifting it from beside the stairs. A little scorched, but mostly intact. Jonah cheered. We're decorating today? It's Christmas Eve, isn't it? Eve said. Caleb chuckled. Don't ask me. I stopped counting after the roof fell in. They set to work, stringing lights along the window frames, hanging the rescued stockings. Above the new hearth, Lila taped paper stars to the bookshelf. Micah placed a pine cone wreath on the door, and when it came time for the tree, they didn't buy one. They went outside, together. Bundled in scarves and boots, they stood at the foot of the sapling they'd planted months ago. It was still small, barely chest high, but stronger now, holding its own. Eve placed her hand on Caleb's arm. I want to decorate this one. He nodded. Micah brought out the paper ornaments. Jonah tied loops of red yarn. Lila hung a lopsided angel on the lowest branch. No lights, no glitter, just them, and the wind, and the early hush of snow beginning to fall again. That night they ate dinner around the table with no phones, no TV, no noise but their voices and the steady hum of warmth. Eve lit 3 candles. Jonah insisted on singing. Lila fell asleep halfway through dessert, and Caleb just looked around, at the life they had made, at the family they had chosen, at the fire still burning. After the children were tucked into bed, Eve found him on the front porch, hands tucked into his coat, breath clouding in the cold. You okay? You? She asked. He nodded. More than okay. She stepped closer, leaned into his side. You thinking about her? He didn't have to ask who. I always do, he said softly. But not like before. Eve didn't speak. She didn't need to. I think Marin would have liked you, he added, voice cracking just enough to feel real. Eve looked at him, eyes shimmering. I like to think she helped guide me here. They stood in the dark for a long moment. Then Eve whispered, "So, it was home?" Caleb looked toward the tree, toward the light in the windows, toward the place his life had cracked open and something new had grown. "It is now," he said. She slipped her hand into his, held on. 1 year later, snow fell soft again on Christmas Eve. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed. The hearth, new but familiar, flickered gold and red. The cradle now held a sleeping baby girl, Hope, born in October, her hair the color of wheat and lungs strong enough to wake the stars. Caleb sat in his chair. Lila played with wooden blocks by the fire. Jonah helped Eve with the dishes. Micah taped the newest drawing to the fridge, a sketch of all of them, stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked tree with the words, "Our home." Outside, the promise tree stood tall enough now to see from the kitchen window, its branches dusted with snow, its roots growing deeper, and beneath it, in letters carved carefully by hand, "The last Christmas, hearth planted in winter. Grown in love. Built to last." If this story found a quiet place in your heart, stay with us. Sometimes the smallest lights burn the longest, and sometimes the home we never expected becomes the one we never want to leave.